Welcome to our annual AOA induction lecture and ceremony. And we are delighted that we have such a close colleague, such a dear friend, Dr. Robert, and he prefers red, Schiller. The title of today's lecture is The Community as Classroom, Training Future Physicians to Make a Difference. And as a renowned educator in the field of primary care, I thought it would only be fitting if another renowned educator in the field of primary care, our very own Dr. E. Faber, came and introduced our guest speaker. So welcome, Dr. Faber. Please come up. And they're closely acquainted, so there's no finer person for this job.
Thank you for the privilege. So Red Schiller is someone I've known peripherally for many years, and I'll tell you a story about that in a minute, but he's here to talk to us about really helping to train future physicians outside of the boundaries of the hospital or the office room, and that's really something that I hold dear because our patients live their whole lives out in the community, and they come in to see us, and we need to be able to see all of them and treat the whole of them. And so Red has spent his career working on really taking care of people and teaching others to do the same. He's currently the Chief Academic Officer at the Institute for Family Health and the DIO and the Senior VP for Academic Affairs. He's the Vice Chair and Associate Professor at Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. And there are numerous other topics, other titles I'm not even going to go through all of, but I'm going to talk to you about the first time that I met him. So when I graduated from my residency, I decided to come back to New York City after training here at Downstate and becoming an AOA member then. And I wanted to work in a community where I felt like I could be of need. And Dr. Schiller was working at the Long Island College Hospital at that point, and he interviewed me. And it was the first time I'd met him, and I thought, this is like a great guy. He has so much energy, and he's excited, and he really cares about the people that he works with and the residents that he's training. And I was very interested in that job, but Downstate stole me away. So I've been here ever since. And then, you know, I've watched him and known about the work that he's done. He really was instrumental in developing the Institute for Family Health, which has training for family medicine doctors at teaching health centers, and really was one of the first places to say, sometimes the best place to train a doctor is outside of the hospital. And his graduates have gone on to, you know, create new things and do wonderful work out in the community. And I always think, as myself, an educator, that my legacy is in those who I've trained, and I know that Dr. Schiller has a huge legacy and is still continuing to create that. So there's no better person to learn about the type of work that he does and a new idea, or what I hope is a new idea for many of you, about how we should think about medical education and what we really have the power to do as we train doctors, as you all become doctors and become educators for the students and the residents in the room. So I hope you find this as inspiring as I found knowing him.
Thank you, Eve. That was very kind. Was it that we didn't offer you enough money? Is that what it was?
I took the other job first.
No, and that was that whole experience with Long Island College, which, as we will discuss, there are a number of hospitals that have disappeared or are disappearing, and that's somewhat relevant to the topic that I want to talk about today. First of all, I unfortunately was not in AOA, so I guess it's a little bit of the imposter syndrome of being here. It's a real honor to speak today. I think people who've been recognized for going above and beyond, which is really what AOA is about, is, you know, the criteria have been expanded, is really something that you should feel good about. This is a challenging time for medical education, and to be able to excel and to accomplish what you've accomplished, you should feel good. And family members that are here, welcome. You should feel good as well. So today is an exploration. You know, I realize many of us think of medical schools and hospitals as almost interchangeable. Medical schools consider hospitals the classroom where clinical work gets done. And I'd like us to think a little bit differently about that. When we think about what the system is like now, and what the kind of changes that we need in keeping people well, keeping them out of the hospital, minimizing emergency room visits. The work really is in the community. And what I've discovered over my years of practice is what happens with patients between visits is actually the work. And so this is really about how to explore that opportunity of the community as being part of the classroom and members of the community as being part of the faculty. No financial disclosures. So before we start, I want to do something that I feel is really important in terms of my own personal life and our work, is take a moment to reflect. And so if this is voluntary, so for people who choose to, close your eyes, adjust yourself comfortably in your chair. Take a deep breath in through your nose and out through your mouth. And as you continue to breathe, you may be aware of certain tension in your body, certain thoughts that are distracting, some sounds in the room. As you notice these things, return to your breathing. Feel your chest rise as you breathe in, and your chest relax as you breathe out. And as we sit here together, let's acknowledge people who've helped us get to where we are in our lives. Our families, partners if you have one, colleagues, friends, mentors, patients, all the people who've helped us achieve what we've accomplished. And just take a moment to acknowledge them and express our gratitude. And certainly to those of us, those who are closest to us. Despite how challenging life is and the work of being a healer, it is these other people who are part of our lives who make us capable of achieving our goals. And as we sit here together, we can open our eyes, come back into the room, and acknowledge each other. So for those who participated, thank you. I use this exercise a lot with every patient. So in a clinical setting, and just sit for 90 seconds. And actually before administrative meetings, which might seem unusual. But one of the things about a moment of reflection is it helps you pause. And especially in this work, when we're going from one patient to the next, or one administrative meeting to the next, is to leave the previous interaction behind and go with an openness and an acceptance of what's about to happen. When we're with patients and colleagues, we want to be fully present. We want to try to be ourselves. And this is pretty challenging work. So I've just found over the years that this exercise can be really helpful. You can add other things to it. And it's, for those of you who are particularly interested, I'm happy to sort of go into details about how this, there's actually a field that's emerging called contemplative medicine that's using this kind of moment of reflection in a very rigorous way. So the questions today is there a role for community in medical education? What do we even mean by community? If so, what is its role? What is the role of academic medicine in this connection? And specifically, what could this mean for Brooklyn? I've lived in Brooklyn since 1985. So to me, Brooklyn is home. So where are we as a profession in education? It's a tough time. We're alienated, burnt out, exhausted. We've got some PTSD to deal with from the pandemic. The benefits and burdens of technology, virtual visits, virtual meetings, opened up a bunch of things, but it's also frustrating when you really want to connect with people. And the impact on our medical education and just the tyranny of the EHR that we all sort of live with and trying to struggle with. We also have a lot of greed in the healthcare system. Don Berwick, who you may know, wrote a really interesting article about greed. And he titled the article Salve Lucrum, which actually is Latin for hail profit. So we're dealing with a time when there's a lot of distress, but much of what's being driven by the healthcare system is profit and finances. There's erosion of trust between our society and profession, just the whole issue of what is science and do we believe science, and some of the challenging views of anti-vaxxers and other people who are disrespectful of the history and the traditions of scientific medicine. Also, there's the fraying of the bond between teacher and trainee, a lot more tension about sort of moral injury, the stress that students are under and feeling like they're being asked to do things that they feel are offensive. Could get to this a little bit more, but if there's inadequate resources for training or patient care, there's this sense now of indignation as opposed to a period when we were in this together and we will figure out how to optimize what we do have rather than lament what we don't. There's also inadequate financing of Medicaid. FQHCs is where I work and live. And there's the issues of hospital closures. Among my jobs, which I didn't talk about yet today, is I'm the president of the medical board for Mount Sinai Beth Israel, which is about to close. Except the judge has said, you can't close yet. So that particular institution is completely in turmoil. I mean, they can't hire people. And so there are these real challenging issues in the healthcare system. And those of us in education feel, almost as parents, that we want to protect people, our students and our trainees, from what is really the craziness of a system that needs direction and ultimately needs leadership. So, these are particularly challenging times. And I think this is a particularly poignant cartoon that was in the New Yorker. I don't want people to leave with this impression that a 90-second meditation is going to make things go away. What this person needs, who's burning at the stake, is a fire extinguisher, not yoga, obviously. But you can, the point being that we really, when things are this intense, we need to respond in kind. So what I want to talk about today is some of these concepts of right-sizing inpatient versus ambulatory training. What is the role of a hospital in 2024, 2025, when we really know that it's social determinants, it's structural racism, it's housing inequities, it's all these issues that are keeping people from being healthy, and yet we spend so much time teaching in the hospital. There's the opportunity for interprofessional training with nurses, diabetic educators, and that's really where we'll talk when we talk some more about FQHCs and community health centers. And in order to impact the social determinants of health, you need to make these connections with community groups. There's something, if you look at the history of medical education and the role that hospitals played, for many years, especially in the 19th and early 20th century, till the Flexen Report, people got cared for at home when they were ill, not in hospitals. When hospitals began to develop as institutions that provided treatment, it wasn't clear what role teaching would play in that setting. And it really took generations to figure this out. So if you think about sort of the history of medical education and how to optimize the role of the community as a classroom, there are a lot of steps that we need to take to develop relationships with community organizations, looking at the financing of this, what are the social structures. And understand that community organizations are skeptical. They're going to ask questions about, we have to put resources into something like this. What's going to be our benefit? And two other points I want to raise is the role of advocacy. A theme about today's talk is advocacy is going to become more and more important. And as physicians, and certainly young physicians and physician leaders, there's a price to be paid for sitting on the sidelines and for not getting involved and having your voice heard. Because decisions are going to be made for us, as they are. And it's up to us to work with community organizations and government groups to make a difference. And then community-based research, doing work with community organizations where, there's something called community-based participatory research, where community organizations can get involved in why is this neighborhood such have serious asthma, for example, among kids of school age, or why is there such a high incidence of substance use disorder? Or in other words, what are the issues that a lot of communities are facing that they need our help? A little bit of history about community health centers. Jack Geiger and Count Gibson were two physicians, and in 1965, they started the first community health center. One was in Dorchester, Mass., and the other was in Mount Bayou, Mississippi. And these were progressive models that were part of the Office of Economic Opportunity. It's hard to picture this country in 1965, but Medicare had just been introduced, Medicaid had been introduced, and there was a lot of interest in social investment in trying to transform our society so it would be healthier and less discriminatory. And these were two leaders who started that movement. And this is sort of some of the impact. They recognize that poverty, racism in marginalized communities are major causes of illness. There's a story that Jack Geiger had a site visit from the federal government, and they came down and realized that he was writing prescriptions for food and giving out food in the health center using federal dollars that were supposed to be given for drugs. And his point was, well, if malnutrition is an illness and the textbooks say food is the treatment for malnutrition, what am I supposed to do? So this idea of treating people where they're at and with the things that will make a difference that may run counter to the prevailing thought and expectations. Another thing they did is they taught a lot of the people of these are rural communities certainly in the South, to that really the solution to the malnutrition is they would grow their own food. And so he was spending federal dollars for the health center on tractors and fertilizer and feed. The point of bringing this up is this is 1965. Like, this was a very visionary, thoughtful people who were onto something about how to make a difference and what role you can play. They provided employment for people in that community, many of whom would get careers in nursing or became physicians or other technicians in the health center. And the other thing is that the health centers were governed by patients and the community. And so one of the things about community health centers by statute, in other words, to be eligible to be a community health center, more than 51% of the governing board has to be patients who are active patients of the center. And think about what our healthcare system would look like if patients were more than half of the board of trustees and directors of hospitals and medical schools. And inevitably, they would get involved in local politics, and particularly around the civil rights movement and the voting rights movement. You know, these institutions became pillars of the society. As I said, they started in 1965. Now there's about 1,400 community health centers serving over 31 million people. And that's data from 2023. So let me talk a little bit about my work and my organization. When I went to medical school, I went into family medicine for two reasons. One is there was no area that I didn't want to stop learning about. I was too curious. And the other was I realized when I was working with family medicine residents and attendings, if I felt miserable and overwhelmed, these were people who I would want to be with, who sort of shared my sense of humor, and also a sense of purpose and calling. We were really about the relationship, not necessarily the procedure. And so I went to school in New York City. In family medicine, you were really discouraged. Even primary care, which is still an issue, which is less of an issue here, but still a challenge in the number of academic centers in New York who continue to produce students and residents that are in subspecialties and not really doing community-based work. So the Institute, as an organization, is a network of FQHCs that provides high-quality, patient-centered care, medical education, and we do a lot of policy and research. We were founded in 1983, have centers really throughout the metropolitan area, and then even in the mid-Hudson Valley, which is roughly about an hour and a half from New York State. We try to be comprehensive with primary care, behavioral health, dental, and support and enabling services. It's really those people, the support enabling services, dealing with patients who are asylum seeking and need a lot of help, people who don't have insurance and need help accessing specialists or medications, housing, food assistance, those kinds of things. And we're mission driven and don't turn people away. So everybody who works there really sort of shares that mission. I mentioned the issue about governance, and these are some of the other facilities we work with: school-based health centers, people who are unhoused in programs, health homes, and also a shared savings program with Medicare. What's unique about what our organization is, and this is really when I started working there in 1985, is we wanted to be a teaching organization in addition to a service organization. This idea that there could be an alternative to the traditional academic setting of a hospital and medical school. We want it to be a health center and a training organization. Not knowing exactly what that was going to be like, we started with what's called the Faculty Development Training Grant. This is something that you get from the federal government to teach teachers. Over the years, we've developed 4 family medicine residency programs. 2 are teaching health center programs. A third one is sponsored by Mount Sinai. And then a 4th one is a teaching health center we're slated to open in 2026, which is with Downstate, and we're so grateful to have Downstate as a partner. We have fellowships in addiction medicine, clinical research, integrative family medicine, sort of like lifestyle family medicine, and reproductive health care advocacy. We have a nurse practitioner residency. These are nurse practitioners who just completed their training but don't feel adequately trained or competent enough to be independent. So there's a year-long training program that's funded by the federal government. We have a dental residency that we're a site for Mount Sinai. And pre-pandemic, we were teaching about 300 learners. So this was a robust enterprise. Those are our 2 academic centers. Westchester Medical Center and New York Medical College are the academic partner for our upstate programs. And here's some principles of this educational model we're talking about. This is mission-driven education. And what that means is the purpose of why we're teaching is to make a difference in the communities we're serving. It's not simply an academic exercise in and of itself. And we pride ourselves on that. Our mission is the North Star. And it also means that we need to correct things along the way when our community changes. So, for example, I started working right at the very early stages of the HIV epidemic. And we had to shift what we were doing, because one of the places that I work was actually a union health center that took care of people who were mostly retirees from a clothing workers union. They were people with HIV disease who had no place to go, and sort of we had to figure out how to provide those services and access for those patients, and work with organizations like ACT UP, the Gay Men's Health Crisis, to be able to provide some of those training opportunities. Our clinical sites are these health, federally qualified health centers. And very briefly, what that means is you're designated by the federal government to provide these services and given additional grant money to make up for the expense of taking care of people who don't have insurance. So, and specifically for people on Medicaid, we get an enhanced rate. For people on Medicare, we get an enhanced rate. Our model is actually a lot more expensive because we have all these other services, some of which are diabetic educators, nutritionists, case managers. There's not reimbursement for those services, but what we do is we get this grant money because of this designation. And it gives us an opportunity for interprofessional training, for case conferences, when we get together for our monthly staff meetings, we talk about cases, and the residents and the students who are rotating are part of those discussions, and they're learning how to work together as a team so that when you deal with these patients in a clinical setting and you're feeling overwhelmed, there's a team of people right next to you who can help you with those patients. Team-based care, something called primary care, medical home, which is a certain designation, meaning there's a level of continuity. That's one of the things that we really strive for, is having patients see their own doctor, so that that level of confidence and trust that builds over time can be reinforced. And an example of some of the training experiences is specifically for our residents who want to work with recently incarcerated and recently incarcerated and released, rather, domestic violence survivors, gender affirming care programs, unhoused. And, we all try to develop these programs in alignment with regulatory agencies, which in the case of residency programs is the ACGME. And we do a fair amount of research. We have an annual research symposium that's actually in 2 weeks. This is the 12th year. Examples of one-stop cancer screening that was funded from the New York Community Trust. Basically, what that means is patients come and they get an appointment for colonoscopy, if they need it, mammography, and have a pap test done all in the same visit. And it tries to really minimize fragmentation of care. Screening for hypertension among pregnant people. Ignite, which is a genetic screening program for at-risk populations. An interesting multi-center trial in acupuncture and chronic pain in seniors. And some of these other grants that we received. Robin Hood specifically for dealing with our diabetic care and reducing disparities. We discovered one thing in our early work with diabetes is we were able to reduce the high rate of blood sugar in all of our patient cohorts, white, African, Latin, but we couldn't reduce the difference. So people all got better, but the differences that they came in with were preserved because we were doing the same thing for all of the patients. When we realized what we needed to do is have a different model of care for different groups of patients based on their level of control. And one of the things that led to is we really needed the help of a diabetic educator to get people to under that control. And so that was one of the things that Robin Hood helped us with. And they also supported Free Clinic. So this is a small group. We can take a moment. Any questions before we, if you don't have any, that's fine. So I want to talk about two programs that sort of highlight this model that I'm talking about. One is a primary care scholars program that we work with Mount Sinai on, and the other is Teaching Health Center GME. So this is a program that was started in 2015. The idea behind this was when we started the department at Sinai in 2012. Part of what our goal was to increase the number of people going into primary care that would work in marginalized communities, basically FQHCs. And we wanted to increase the diversity of physicians that chose that, create some clinical experiences that would really enhance their skills, continuity, quality improvement, advocacy, clinical research. And we wanted to do it in a teaching setting so that the students who were there felt like, I belong here, because I'm not just being put in some community setting where I'm not going to get the experiences, getting the challenge. One of the things about the site that we chose, which is our Harlem site, is every Wednesday afternoon is a teaching afternoon for the residency program that these students would participate in. And there are frequently interdisciplinary opportunities. And create this learning community dedicated to this type of training. So this is supported by private philanthropic money. And one of the other benefits is there was a tuition assistance award of $20,000 for each of 4 years, so a total of $80,000. So if a student finished this program over 4 years and chose to go into a primary care specialty, and by primary care we mean family medicine, internal medicine, pediatrics, OBGYN, and psychiatry, actually. They would get the $80,000 that would go towards their tuition. As I said, it was started in 2015. There were 6 per class. And there are still some students in this. 26 graduated all, and basically 80% are in medically underserved locations. Some are in medically underserved training programs. Not everybody stayed. And the unfortunate thing about this program is the dean of the medical school changed and the philanthropic support stopped. So people are just continuing to complete for this year and next. So it's being unwound. We are looking for additional funding because we found this to be so successful. The student interest was really overwhelming. And, but it's a cautionary note about this work, which is this is not business as usual. And so the learning moment is, it's great that you had it, but you need to think about sustainability in these models and realize that you need to anticipate that some of the support may stop. And we will continue to look for support and see if this will continue. But it really, there are similar programs around the country of really trying to target primary care as a focus for medical students as early as possible. The curriculum includes working with patients with chronic illness, asthma, diabetes, congestive heart failure, or working with marginalized populations. And basically these are group learning experiences, frequently with somebody from a community organization or a family with one of those chronic conditions. And some of the questions like the students ask is, what would you like your doctor to know about you? This is an opportunity to really explore the relationship and the community connections that are really essential to be an exceptional physician. And then we set up time to meet with people in the Department of Health or public health or clinical specialty expert as well. And one of the highlights was there's a lobby day for community health centers. It's the first Monday in March. We all go up to Albany and express our concern that the legislators support community health centers. And it's a great opportunity for students to learn about that work. Teaching health centers. So this is one of these gems that was buried in the Affordable Care Act. And really it's based on one person, yes, Obamacare. And this is really the result of a person, Fitzhugh Mullen, who we'll acknowledge at the end. But part of this included a unique way of paying in developing residency programs. And this is a little wonky and in the weeds, so forgive me for a second. But most of the way residents are paid for is through Medicare, believe it or not. Only in America do you have a model like this. So every time a patient with Medicare gets discharged from the hospital, there's an additional amount of money the hospital gets by having residents. So that money is basically what's called an entitlement. It's just given indefinitely, and it's a model where there's no accountability for what type of residents they train. They could train all neurosurgeons, and Medicare would still pay that same amount. So, and that leads to some of the maldistribution of specialty and location that we have. Not entirely, but part of that. This was an attempt to correct that with something called the Teaching Health Center model that's funded through a different organization called HRSA, Human Resource Service Administration, which does a lot of public health funding. And this is a program which was, the goal was increasing access to primary care services in areas of need, correcting health disparities, developing innovative community-based program, and expanding the primary care workforce. So it's very mission-driven. It's not a blank check in terms of resident education. And so part of people who get these programs, and we have 2 and the third is in development, is this accountability that I described. You have to report on where your residents go to the government to monitor this. And the scope, just to give you a scope, there's about 81 of these around the country in 24 states, over 1,000 residents providing 1 million visits annually. With a current goal, there's a whole initiative through the Inflation Reduction Act of doubling the number of residents in the next 5 years in primary care. There are a host of issues with this program, but the real point I want to make is this is, again, a mission-driven training program with accountability. Here's some of the results. 2/3 of practicing in a primary care setting, over half practice in a rural and medically underserved setting, a quarter actually practice in fairly qualified health centers. And here's some other things. They're more likely to offer behavioral health and substance use disorders in their practice. So you're impacting access and you're impacting care. You're impacting actually what the providers of care are offering. And the vast majority, because of the way it's designed, train in rural settings. This is a redundant slide, so I apologize for that. One of the points is this program also results in savings for Medicare and Medicaid because of the role that primary care plays in the services that they provide. Here's some benefits in terms of their organization. We were one of the first. There were 11 programs in 2011. And this was all brand new. It was a challenge to get approval and funding, which I won't even go into. But what's happened over the last 10 plus years is medical students have heard about these programs, and this is where they want to train. They want to make a difference, and they realize that where they train, the way the place is financed, the way the place is governed, the way the place is operated, is going to impact who they are as doctors. And that blew my mind. When I started interviewing people and realized they knew more about this program than many of the faculty, because medical students, as this group knows, are well informed. So this was a fascinating phenomenon. So we're seeing the demand for this program just increase. It's a great way to hire and retain graduates because people frequently want to stay, and they like this model of the way it's organized. It really helps with diversity. The challenge that many of us face with is trying to recruit a diverse workforce. And in our setting, you want to recruit a workforce that looks like the people that they care for, because the people who they care for want the doctors to look like them. So it's an important component. It helps with faculty commitment, recruitment and retention. And also within our organization, the board of directors is very interested in our training programs. Every year when we review our program, they ask for residents or fellows to come to the meeting. We want to hear about what our residents and fellows are doing. What can the organization do to support them to get their training improved? What they're going to do with their plans for graduation. And some of the things that we talked about in terms of community-based collaboration. And just to highlight the fact that advocacy, again, is an important part of meeting with legislatures and meeting with residents. I've been down to Washington probably 7 or 8 times, and just a few anecdotes. So in the early days of lobbying for this and just getting Congress to understand what the program was, there was a couple of Congress people's offices that were not fans of the Affordable Care Act because they weren't fans of Obama or Democrats. So you'd walk into the office, and one office had the entire act in a pile of paper that was stacked 7 feet tall with an axe in it and fake blood dripping down the side of the paper. Like, this is Congress. Like, hello? But interestingly enough, when you got past the rhetoric, everybody could agree on people needed good care. Because all the representatives, whether in Congress or senators, knew their constituents wanted a community health center in their communities, and they wanted to be able to staff it. And this is a program that staffs those facilities. You train in this place, you're going to be there for a good period of time. You will grow old there. And now, so those were in the early 2010s. Now when we go to Washington, almost everybody knows what these programs are. They're very much in support of it. It's just because of the way, the impossible way that we train doctors where their year starts in July to June, but the funding starts in October to September. And then there's a different calendar for how legislation is handled. It's quite the challenge to get people to understand how these programs can be sustained financially. But that's the role of advocacy. And, this is not why I went to medical school. So clearly, learning this stuff is not the kind of thing that you necessarily want to do. But when you realize this is the hard work of getting the basic stuff taken care of, really crucial. So this is some of our data. Roughly 18% of our grads in our Mid-Hudson program. That was the first program in 2011. And then the second program in Harlem was started 2012. Again, about 20% have been hired, and those are the high percentages of working in underserved communities. So I want to conclude. So the caduceus has these 2 serpents, which represent wisdom and knowledge. We are very focused on the knowledge piece and evidence. I'll reserve judgment about wisdom at this point where it's not clear. We're exercising our wisdom, and those of us who are getting older realize how important wisdom is when it comes to making decisions. But what I want to highlight is the fact that communities have wisdom. They have leaders. They have people who are dedicated. They've spent time in those communities to garner respect and develop insight. And it's my conviction that this intertwining of wisdom and knowledge as clinicians and educators could also include communities, specifically community leaders, who want to be part of this. And in part to establish and maintain trust in this crazy post-pandemic world that we're still trying to make sense of. We would use this relationship to establish priorities of care, thinking about when we get up in the morning as physicians, to not necessarily start with what we're worried about, but what our communities that we serve are worried about. What do they need us for? What do they want us to do? And it's my experience that behavioral health and substance use is clearly, like, that's why we started an addiction medicine fellowship. We needed that expertise. It's just crazy that for a while, buprenorphine required prior approval. Are you kidding me? Like, and for the people who don't understand, medical assisted treatment or buprenorphine is treatment for opiate use disorder, for people who are craving an opiate. And if you go to a pharmacy, sometimes the health plan won't pay for it unless you go through certain hoops for approval. And understanding the complexity of that problem and what we can do to help the communities requires a level of expertise that we actually develop with this addiction medicine fellowship. Another point is really to restore the calling of medicine with more mission-driven training. Sort of jumping to this last point, advocacy and engagement are antidotes to malaise and despair. It's my sense that as challenging as medicine is, and as hard as it is for young physicians to go into a system, I mean, let's not go into what's going on in the world right now, but just in this profession, in this community, with what we're faced with and what we just went through with the pandemic, it's understandable how desperate people might feel and how challenging a choice of the career that you're about to embark on is going to be. Many of us went into medicine because of the calling. It's just an exceptional gift to be able to give back in the way that you can. And so we really believe that this connection to community, or I'll just use the pronoun I believe this connection to community can restore that sort of sense of calling and purpose. So when you're muttering under your breath about the latest indignation or moral injury, it's for a purpose. And just a more practical point, just the issues of financing improvements in healthcare infrastructure and training. The governor has made some difficult decisions about Medicaid, and we get how expensive Medicaid is in the New York State budget. There's some money to help Downstate deal with its crisis. The finance markets have generated a lot of tax revenues, and we just need to make our voices heard. Finally, two voices that I wanted to bring up is people, I knew Carl Cohn as a medical student, and he was a real inspiration. He also had a really great sense of humor. In one of the groups of the Medical Committee for Human Rights, which he was involved with, and he really was an inspiration, and really sad to hear of his passing. So for you people who don't know it, I'm sorry if you didn't. It's okay. He's a loss. And then Fitz Mullen, who I got to know as well in the latter part of his career, who, as I said, did this legislation and started a group called Beyond Flexner, or what's now called the Social Mission Alliance at George Washington University, is another mentor and an exemplar of somebody who can make a difference. There's a book called White Coat, Clenched Fist that he wrote, which is about when the community took over Lincoln Hospital in the early 70s. Yes, the community took over a hospital. And one of the things that happened during this time, I mean, a lot of interesting things happened in the 60s and 70s, even though the 220s seemed pretty interesting. The rounds were organized by the interns. So the hierarchy was completely flipped, and things were quite interesting and challenging. That's actually when acupuncture was introduced for substance use disorder, because the community knew of acupuncturists that were local, that were actually treating opiate use disorder. And the hospital couldn't support it for a variety of reasons during this brief period. So Fitz wrote about that in this book, White Coat, Clenched Fist, and I just share that because tonight I really want to just stress that medicine is an exciting opportunity right now. It's fraught with all kinds of challenges. I just wanted to highlight one place where people can make a difference around renewed connections with community and thinking like, what would a medical school's experience be like if there was more community involvement? What would a residency program look like? And what benefit would those communities have 10 to 15 years from now by having a healthcare system that really took the lead from them in a partnership? Thank you very much. So I'm open to questions, but if anybody has any answers, I'm also open to those as well.
How do you attract a larger number of students to primary care fields when there's financial incentives
There's a mortgage.
to go elsewhere? There's mortgage, there's colleges that are $90,000 now.
Yeah.
Any thoughts?
Well, I think the the opportunity for collaborating, first of all, acknowledging that that's an issue is really important. Because I think we don't really stress the fact that financial burdens for people going into higher education is horrible. And people are choosing not even to go to college, as you know. I think taking as much advantage of loan forgiveness as possible. There's a program called Doctors Across New York, which is a nominal amount of money towards tuition assistance. This is something I think that the legislatures could take up. And basically, there are some states that actually pay for graduate education. New Mexico is one. We've been trying to get the state legislature in New York to recognize that. And one of the things that we're trying to do, we've tried to do this up at Mid-Hudson with working with local banks, is basically do our own loan forgiveness program for our residents. That would be a heavy lift in New York City. But upstate, where they may not have had a new primary care doctor for 20 years, a bank very much might. A real estate company, basically, one of our graduates upstate actually, the down payment on her house was paid for. This is in Ellenville, New York, for people who remember the Borscht Belt. The local community got together and put down the down payment on her house. So it's a really good question. I mean, the current structures aren't going to allow us to do this, and not everybody's going to have, a Langone or somebody who's going to basically give, or the woman who donated to Einstein. I mean, on the other hand, looking at the cost of medical education and trying to see if there are lower cost alternatives, maybe we need to think about a primary care track within medical school. And just, these are uncomfortable conversations, actually. I think that, because for people who don't appreciate, the curriculum is a land grab, and departments are fight over how much time they have with students. But I think that the idea that we could just focus on training primary care doctors in a more efficient way and say, maybe the tuition is significantly less forgiven. It's a real challenge. I mean, it's a really good question. I wish I had a better answer. Rich?
I have a question. You know, a lot of the students that are here this evening, or this afternoon, that will be joining us this evening, are not going into primary care. You've been very eloquent about talking about the importance of interacting with the community. How does an orthopedic department or a dermatology department work with their community? What advice can we give to some of these students who are going into some subspecialties that are not classically involved in the community? Do you have any advice for them?
Thank you for bringing me down to earth. So forgive me for neglecting my specialty colleagues. Those of us in primary care need you. I think my advice is to sit with those of us on primary care, and we've done that over the years by, for example, when we were dealing with special populations who were HIV positive or were receiving gender-affirming care, and working with specialists who were comfortable seeing that population. You know, that's a start in terms of this. But I've worked with departments to help them understand specifically how crucial access and continuity is for providing specialty care. You know, for many specialists, their work begins and ends in a procedure room, either the OR or an AM surgery suite. And I get that. That's actually why you chose that specialty. You like to do things to people, and something needs to be removed, and you can get it out, and people feel better, or they're cured. It's incredibly gratifying and crucial. But part of this is, in working with the community, is how challenging is it to actually get that patient to that room? So for example, there's a colleague of mine who was chair of urology, and we were talking about a patient who's urinating with blood and trying to get that person seen within a day or so, and his view was, well, it can wait a week or two because it's not going to, quote, kill him. And he said, but that's not how this person feels. They feel like they're dying when they see blood in their urine. So I think understanding from the community's perspective the crucial role of access, and you know, it's been really interesting, this whole urgent care phenomenon, which has just completely changed the way in which our care is delivered. But it's kind of a half-baked model because it's based on a consumer-only approach to urgent care. What about behavioral health urgent care? What about orthopedic urgent care, other than the emergency room? So there's a lot of opportunities to think creatively about how you can collaborate. And, you know, again, taking this from the communities, especially the ones whose voice is often the softest, and we don't really hear from their perspective about what these issues are. But it's a very good question, and that's just, we're all biased and unbiased around primary care, and that was evident this afternoon, so my apologies. But we need specialists. It's also interesting that my experience is this is more common in New York. So for example, in more rural or other communities around the country, if there's a health fair that's being organized by a primary care group, it's often the case that a cardiologist or a neurologist who they work with will go to that fair with them because they understand the importance of the primary care relationship for their business, for referral, but also they really feel like they're part of the community. You know, it's a very different sense from some specialists really around the country. Yeah, hi.
So, obviously, all of these programs need money, and you mentioned, without saying who they were, that some of them were privately funded. Have you ever thought about collaborating with the dreaded pharma. We have a program here at Downstate that's funded by 2 different pharmaceutical companies that fund medical students to be patient navigators. And we train them in social determinants of health and how to help their patients in 2 particular specialties, but it could be anywhere, to understand the whole patient and help them navigate the healthcare system. And they're funded by pharma.
Really good question. That and the device manufacturers are 2 places where you're absolutely right. There are resources. We have reached out to Pfizer's foundation when we actually did a study on using EHR for opiate use decision-making. And it worked out. I will say it opens up the door for some also uncomfortable conversations. But, you know, there's a line in these slides that I took out, but I'll use it now. This is a quote I discovered from Abe Lincoln, who said, "I do not like that man. I must know him better." And so if you think about the fact that, and right now I think we're in such a quick to judge mentality about a lot of things in the world. I think that we need to be open to this, you know, because our governments, local, state, and federal, are not the only resource. And I think you raise a really good point. So maybe I'll talk to you afterwards and we can figure out. I mean, especially for the innovative stuff that, I mean, for example, we in the early days of HIV, we did some drug trials. And we said we would participate, but when the trial is over, will you guarantee that the patients who are getting the study drug will continue to get it? And they said, no. They have to, we can't, that's not, and I said, well, that's just cruel. But, so, that's just to say, I mean, again, I just went against what I said about not disparaging. But I do think that it's possible to forge some positive relationships with these organizations, mainly because we need to. It's like, things, for those of us in this sphere of making a difference with public health and community health, we need to be a little bit more open-minded and perhaps a little less self-righteous.
Inclusive.
Yeah. Not easy. Yes.
A soapbox commentary afterwards. I've been thinking a lot recently as someone that's going into emergency medicine that's not with the designation of primary care subspecialties, though that sort of divide between primary care and non-primary care. And I think that's allowed a little bit of complacency within the broader medical community of, oh, it's not my problem. I'm not a primary care specialty, therefore I don't need to think about this. I don't refer to primary care. And I'm wondering whether or not it should be more stated that the way we describe it, every specialty is primary care, and then it's just a different facet of it. So I find that a lot of times folks that end up in emergency, for example, don't have a primary care to turn to, and then we become their primary care. So then to call it not a primary care field would be disingenuous to what the work is that needs to be done for the patients. And I think that also might shift the way people then approach the primary care problems when it comes to their own field, be it neurology or etc. That's just a comment. My question was...
I agree with you, by the way.
What's that?
I agree with you. Because you're talking about where the system needs to go. And we're not there yet. And when it's going to be, and there will be a similarity between emergency medicine and primary care when there's a shortage. That, in other words, that's really the context of a lot of these terms, is dealing with the structural problems in healthcare, not necessarily the clinical issues, which again, we get a little distorted in New York, because a lot of places, certainly around the world, but even in the other parts of the country, I'll let you get your question in a second, by the way, that people do have primary care doctors, but it's like you would have an attorney, an accountant, and it's just part of it. Because you see your primary care doctor when you go to your religious affiliate during the week, or grab a cup of coffee or go get a slice of pizza. So that's the difference.
The question was, over these past 4 years, I've seen numerous students begin community partnerships, be it volunteering opportunities or trying to engage with a certain department of a certain community group. I found that it's very difficult for those partnerships to be sustainable. So I sort of wanted to know what your opinions are on how to have sustainable community partnerships, especially given that there's like a strict beginning and end to a lot of at least middle student work.
You're 2 for 2. That's such a good and important question, because what happens with both students and residents is you rotate, and you're there for kind of a brief period of time. And community organizations really dislike that, because that's their experience of every outside organization trying to help. You know, a philanthropic organization comes in and they see what they, you know, and we'll be happy to write you a check, but pretty much it's one check, and pretty much that's the nature. Like other infrastructure or administrative or consulting support doesn't really happen. So there was one resident who was particularly interested in a community organization who agreed to be on the board, which meant he actually had to attend meetings. So, you know, basically the board is a governing body, so for people, and often boards are where a lot of the decisions get made, finances get addressed, programs get developed. I think what you pose is what kind of relationship would work for communities. And that's where, if you think about it, what about a cohort of, let's say, in groups of 4 or 8 or 12 students, each from a different year, who would be working as a team. So at every key meeting or giving a presentation on health education, you wouldn't necessarily be the one person. It could be a team of people who could have that sustainable relationship, and that, you know, the 4th year student graduates, there's a new 1st year, they're assigned to that community organization. So that's one way we've thought about this. It's hard to implement just because of the time commitment, and usually when learners, residents, or students are available is not necessarily when they're needed. So there's that mismatch. But you can solve that if you have more people who are sort of part of this cohort of collaborating. Really good question.
Right. So we should just mention that, you know, Downstate's done that. I just want to bring to your attention. Probably about 20 years ago, when the Students for Democratic Society, SDS, existed at this medical center, they made a relationship with a homeless shelter in downtown Brooklyn and offered to give talks as well as clinical care on a regular basis. I was one of the preceptors, other people from family medicine.
Of course you were.
So actually we had groups of medical students from all different ages over a period of about 6 or 7 years teaching homeless people about diabetes and actually running a foot clinic which offered foot care over a 6-year period. So it can happen. You just have to have inspired people, you know, to stand up and say, let's go do this. And unfortunately, we haven't had that here, for better or for worse. this existed, I have a plaque in my office that attests, not to me, but to the students who did this. The plaque was actually awarded to the student organization, and I just made a copy of it. So,
The
students, to you folks.
The student-free clinic movement around the country is a good example of that, where, you know, especially at a
Brooklyn Free Clinic.
yeah, exactly. So, but as Rick said, you know, this is leadership. Actually, that's the key issue, and student leadership is really, you know, that's the opportunity. In this kind of setting, to take on this kind of project, and then have the support of an academic organization so that you can make mistakes, and that's okay. Good questions.
Okay, the discussion has been rich. Thank you, Dr. Schiller.
Thank you.